Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So as we all know, we're in some strange times here and trade shows are being canceled and postponed left and right. Some are being pushed into the summer, some are being pushed all the way into the fall. And all over the world, there's thousands of events that are canceled or postponed, whether it's a convention or a conference or a trade show or some other event. For trade shows, you got to ask yourself as a company, say, what's it costing us not to attend these shows? Or even what's it costing us to not attend it now and attend later on? Especially if you're a company that relies on these trade shows for leads and for customer contact and for filling your pipeline, your sales pipeline. If your company mainly relies on trade shows, then really you got to do something else, right? Because if you're not getting your leads or everything gets pushed back to the fall, for example, you have to do something else or you're going to come up short in your sales goals for the year. So many options to do something else. And today in this webinar, we're going to talk about how you can use a webinar to replace your trade show, whether it's canceled or postponed. Now, stipulate right up front here, I know you can't replace the social and the personal interaction, the human interaction that you get at a trade show. You can't replace that with a virtual webinar. That's granted. And we're not saying that you can. What we're saying today is that you can generate leads and you can make customer contact that's fairly meaningful if you put on a good webinar. This webinar is created and presented by Manufacturing Marketing Group, or MMG, and we help industrial companies to set up and execute webinars. And in addition, we also work with manufacturing and industrial companies on their digital marketing and sales process, strategy and tactics. I'm the founder and president of MMG. I'm an engineer with 25 years of sales and marketing experience. And I've created and produced and broadcast hundreds of webinars over the past 10 years. And give you an example of one success story to kind of kick it off is we had a company, up in Massachusetts, and they manufacture digital meters that read out things like tank levels or flow rates and things like that. And they were trying to engage with webinars. And they were doing product webinars, and I'll talk more about product versus education webinars a little later on. But so they were doing product webinars, pitching products and so on, and they'd get 10, 15 people to show up at a webinar. They wanted to do more, and that these guys didn't have a budget for trade shows. So this is how one of their main lead gen functions. So we put together a webinar. It was the basics or the fundamentals of 4 to 20 milliamp current loops, which is a way that you wire these meters. And it sounds easy, and they said, this is too easy. Nobody's going to pay attention to this. It's just two or six screws. So I said, let's give it a try. So we put together a webinar about the fundamentals of 4 to 20 milliamp signals, and we got 634 people for that first webinar. But it doesn't stop at just a live broadcast. That's your main point of engagement. But then these guys also posted the recording of the webinar up to YouTube. And that YouTube webinar, I checked it yesterday, there's 134,000 plus views of that webinar. So think about that engagement. My point is that webinars can be very powerful and they can even do better than certain trade shows. When's the last time you got 600 leads at a trade show? That would be a pretty great show. So that's an example of a success story, how you can get that engagement virtually if you do it well and you have a good topic. Oh, also today on our helping out here on the webinar is Cassidy. She'll be moderating the questions and the chat veins. Welcome, Cassidy.
Hi, guys.
So why are we here? Well, excuse me, as we all know, we're in the crisis mode. Companies are shutting down, people are working virtually, and again, trade shows are canceled left and right or postponed. And assuming you're here because you need lead flow, you need sales pipeline, something to replace those trade shows. And this is, we're going to go through that. We've got a 7-step framework we're going to show, and we're going to talk about how you can use an educational webinar or maybe a product webinar to replace those leads that you normally get at a trade show. And second point, to continue to engage with your customers. I know a lot of folks use trade shows as a central point to visit with their existing customers. This will show you how to leverage that as well. And again, I'll stipulate that we know we can't completely replace a face-to-face visit at a trade show booth, or face-to-face take somebody out to dinner after the show. Can't replace that with a webinar. Let's all agree to that. But we can still get meaningful engagement with folks virtually. We're going to talk about 7 steps. And another thing to think about is your company, especially if the show is canceled, your company may be spending tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars on getting people to a trade show. The booth registration, the travel, the meals, all the other accessories can be pretty expensive. So now perhaps you have a budget, say you have a $50,000 budget up there that's not going to be used. Why not take a portion of that and use some of it to do a webinar? And that's certainly doable. You can all in, depending on how much you use internal people or external people, you could do a great webinar for 1/10 of that for $5,000. So that's why this is an alternative. Here's the 7 steps we're going to cover today. First step is you got to find the audience. You got to find your relevant audience that's related to that trade show or that event. And then even more importantly, you have to know your audience. You got to know what makes them tick, what makes their life miserable, what that you can help with, what problems do they have that you can help with, or even what aspirations they have that you can offer support. We're going to talk about educational content and why that's better than product content. Not that you should never do a product webinar, but we'll talk about that. Talk about the step of creating the webinar. This is the heavy lift in these 7 steps. And then we'll talk about getting your audience to attend, inviting them to attend and how you do that. Talk about your subject matter expert. And then we'll talk about the last step, getting your show promoter involved to help promote your webinar. Those are the 7 steps. By the way, if you have questions or comments, you can enter them into the question panel at any time. Just if you look in your control panel, there should be a tab there that says questions. Just open it up and type in your question at any time, and then we'll put all the questions together towards the end of the webinar. So number 1, find your audience. So you ask a couple of questions to yourself or to your team and say, well, why do we think our customers and prospective customers were going to attend this particular show? Why do they go to it? And then you want to think about what expertise or knowledge do you or your company have that's directly related to the show. I've got a case study here that we're going to use as we go through these steps. And the case study is that there's a trade show called Interphex, and some of you may have heard of it. And Interphex is a show that's everything related to pharmaceutical drug production, everything. And it's usually held at the Javits Center in New York, and it's usually held in April. So obviously this one has postponed because we know there's other things going on in Javits Center right now. And so this is postponed till July. And our hypothetical company is a measurement instrument company. We manufacture instruments that measure things like temperature, relative humidity, maybe particles, things like that a pharmaceutical company needs to measure in their environment. And the purpose of the monitoring, in addition to just the monitoring, is recording the parameters to comply with the FDA regulations, which can be very complex. We know that our attendees, our audience includes, or the attendees to the show are everything related to drug manufacturing. So obviously there's a segment that we want to talk to and that we would normally hope, excuse me, come by our booth. In this particular company, we know that our audience comes to the show, Interfex, to learn about best practices for maintaining an environment, measuring an environment, recording the environment, documenting it, and then complying with FDA regs. And from past experience, we know that one of the common questions people come up to the booth and ask is they want to know what's new. What's new, whether it's new products or new process or new information, what's new? And we usually also, this hypothetical company, we usually also have an expert speaker who's lined up to give a seminar or give a speech to an audience at the trade show. So that's our hypothetical company and why we would be going to this show. And actually, it's a real show, Interfex, that we would attend. Now, our audience are going to be people who would have attended this show. So how do we get in touch with them? How do we find them? First thing you want to do is see if the trade show promoter will give you the list of the registrants, the show registrants. I know Interfex will sell you the list, but they'll at least provide the list. And then from that list, you can usually segment down to people who are relevant to your offering or your product. Then take a look at your in-house database and look through your in-house database and select people who are also likely to attend the show or may attend the show or fit that profile. And many times the trade shows are associated with a trade association. For example, Interfex is very tightly integrated with an organization called the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineers. And those trade associations always have a huge list, and they may also be willing to let you get a message in front of their audience. So you find that audience and you aggregate it and you pick them to invite to your webinar. So once you have to also, and these lists, the 7 lists, are not necessarily sequential. So they may or may not be, but there's 7 things you have to do for this process. Number 2 is you have to know your audience. You got to understand what their pain point is, what their problem is, or what their aspiration is. And not only what those pain points or problems are, but you have to understand how your offering and your company can help work with those issues. So, and then you also want to know not only the company that has those problems, but who's the specific person or the persona, if you will, that you want to talk to. Is it a manager or executive suite or technician? Who do you want to talk to? And then think again about how can you make this person's life a little easier or a little better with your solution. And when you think about that, then you start to really understand that audience and how you can help them. Because for a webinar to replace a trade show, the content that you share has to be very, very relevant for them to agree to spend time with you on the webinar. So it has to be relevant, and for it to be relevant, you have to know your audience. For our Interfex show and our hypothetical company, we know that our audience is made up of compliance managers, metrologists, QA and QC managers, facilities managers, and process engineers. That's the persona we want to talk to. And these would be from pharmaceutical manufacturing companies. We know that one of the major pain points, one of the major things these guys, this whole group not struggles with, but is challenged with every day, is FDA compliance. So our company happens to have experts on staff who their whole job is to understand FDA compliance. And the reason is because our company sells a product that measures and documents the environmental parameters. So if we can share information that helps to make compliance with the FDA regulations easier, or if you want to be more blunt, if we can help them keep the FDA off their backs with data management and data security, for example, that's going to make their day a little better, make their life a little better. And so that's what we know about our audience. And you have to consider, what do you know about your audience, where you can help. And to take it a little further with the topic, once you know your audience, then you have to come up with your topic. And educational content or product content. Perhaps, let's say you are planning to launch a new product at this trade show, and the launch is still on schedule, but the trade show is not. You could do a webinar about that product launch, but caveat, I can guarantee you from 10 years of webinar production, product webinars will never match the engagement or the number of people you get with an educational webinar. Probably 1/10 of the people will show up for a product webinar versus an educational webinar, maybe less. Not to say never do a product webinar. It may be relevant and you can try it, but I guarantee, again, you're not going to get the engagement you would get with an educational webinar. I mentioned earlier that people would come up to the booth and say, what's new? And that's could be a topic for a webinar. What's new, or new products. People like new stuff. And so you may get some engagement that way. But again, my experience is you're not going to get very much engagement. Got to give them something they can use. As I mentioned in the previous slide, give them something that makes their life a little better, a little easier. If you can do that, then you're going to get big engagement. So basically, the topic, topic. So I call it the sweet spot topic. And the sweet spot topic, as you can see from this diagram, it's the intersection of your audience's pain or problem or aspiration that's fairly common to your audience, and that intersection of that and your company's expertise. And that intersection could be the sweet spot topic. So for example, for our measurement instrument company, we know, as we discussed, we know that a main pain point for our target audience is FDA compliance. It's a big pain for a lot of companies because it's so complex. And we know one of the particular struggles companies have is documenting electronic signatures for critical data. So there's an FDA regulation. It's 21 CFR Part 11, and it's about how the FDA wants a company to comply with electronic signatures. That would be a great topic because it's a confusing topic for most folks. We can make that simple and clear that up and give the audience some tools around that particular topic. That would be a sweet spot topic. And it does two things. It does two major things for you as a webinar. One is it gives you TOMA. I always talk about TOMA on our webinars, and it stands for top of mind awareness. What that means is that you do a nice, good, useful educational webinar, then when the time comes around and somebody's ready to buy what you're selling, they remember you. You get the first call. You have top of mind because you have been able to help them with your expertise. The other thing it gets you is credibility. When you're sharing high value expertise, like how to comply with 21 CFR Part 11, for example, you're sharing that expertise, you demonstrate that you really understand it, they're going to go to you when they have a question. So they're going to might call you up or send an email and ask you about that particular topic. But that at the same time, that's a fantastic lead because you can answer their question and then you're open to a conversation. Why were you looking for help with that? What can we do for you? How do you monitor now? All kinds of questions open up because you've got that reciprocity going. Next, you got to create the webinar. And creating a webinar is a very, like any event, there's tons of details and it's very complex. It's easy to create a crappy webinar, but it's not so easy to create a really great webinar. And we just did our previous webinar to this a couple of weeks ago. We did a whole webinar on how to create a webinar. And Cassidy, you could put the link in the chat pane there and share it with everybody. There's a recording on there, and it shows you every step-by-step how to do it. And this is a service that we offer here at MMG. We'll create webinars, and we've got a couple of different levels of packages, from whether it's just consulting or doing the whole thing turnkey. You may consider MMG, or there's other companies that do that too. So you can hire a company to create your webinar. You've got to provide the expertise, but it might be worth it, especially for the first one. And one critical piece of advice: when you do create your webinar, if you do it yourself, make sure you don't wing it. I see that all the time, especially with subject matter experts. They just want to come in and talk about it without practicing. You have to practice a webinar to make it appear to be smooth. So create the webinar. Do we get the link out there, Cassidy?
Yep, it's in the chat pane window.
Okay. So that's feel free to take a look at that. Not right now, because we're doing this webinar after the webinar. Okay, number 5, got to invite the audience, got to get them to sign up. And this is what comes back to our finding your audience section. So once again, you want to get an audience that's relevant, not only the company and the industry relevance, but also the persona relevance. And again, if you can get the list of the trade show registrants, that's ideal. Check out your in-house database. If you have a good database that's fresh and clean and you can segment, use that. Social media is a great place to get people to sign up. And I think LinkedIn paid ads are the best source for this, because if you've ever done a LinkedIn paid ad, or if you've never done one, you can really get specific on the audience. So for example, for our hypothetical company, we could go into LinkedIn and get pharmaceutical companies, the industry, we could get engineers, and we could get a specific region if it's a regional show. So LinkedIn is a pretty powerful way to invite people to sign up for your webinar. You got to pay for it, and it's not cheap. The cost per click is a little bit high, but it's generally the cost per lead from LinkedIn is pretty good. And for signing up, make sure you use an automated process. Many of the webinar platforms will allow automated emails and registration, or if you have marketing automation like HubSpot or Eloqua or Marketo, one of those, you can usually integrate with a webinar platform pretty easily. But automate it, because if you try to do it manually, it's just going to be a mess, unless it's a really tiny list. Number 6, your subject matter expert. This is an easy one if you have somebody lined up for the trade show. Like for example, our hypothetical company, we had an expert lined up to give a speech or a seminar about that very topic that I mentioned, the 21 CFR Part 11. So obviously the speaker would have prepared, obviously, but you would think the speaker would have prepared slides, would have prepared for the presentation, and is all ready to go. So the lift from that live presentation to a virtual webinar presentation would be pretty easy. So that would be ideal. If you don't have somebody lined up, it's good. If you don't have somebody that was already lined up for the show, then look for someone. If you have someone in your company who's known in the industry, who's known as an expert, then that's best, because they can bring their following with them. For example, if you had a company, this measurement company also had a weather business, and the president of the American Meteorological Society happens to also be an employee of the company. That's perfect, because they already have a position, they're known, and they have credibility that helps get people to the webinar. Sometimes you can use people outside of your company who you have a good relationship with, who are also experts. Sometimes you have to pay them to participate, and that might be okay. Again, if you have a $50,000 budget for a trade show and it's canceled, you got a big pot of money there waiting to be spent, right? Avoid using salespeople and senior executives, or not avoid it, but be wary of it. Because if you get a salesperson to be your subject matter expert, they usually default at some point during their presentation to their product pitch. It's very hard for them, usually, not everybody, but a lot of times, it's hard for salespeople to move away from that selling mode. And if you're doing an educational webinar, you don't want to default back to a pitch, because people will be disappointed. expect some kind of a pitch, a little pitch, but not a whole webinar. Again, unless it's a product webinar, we talked about that. Senior executives the problem with senior executives is they're busy. And to do a good webinar, you got to do practice sessions, and you got to, whoever the subject matter expert is, has to put in time with their presentation, with the practice sessions, with all that. And many times you'll ask, I mean, you go to your president of your company, you say, hey, president, we're doing a webinar. You want to be the expert here on our webinar? They're probably going to say yes, because they want to be that center of attention, like most execs do. Maybe that's a different discussion. But just be wary that if a senior executive says they'll do it, make sure they know they're going to have to commit some time. Product managers are great choices for subject matter experts. Application engineers, also great choices. Just be aware that they should have some competence in speaking. So they should, if they've never done public speaking in the past, webinar is really, it's a public speech without the feedback from the audience. So just maybe if they've never done it before, tell them it's going to take some practice and they might need some coaching. Number 7, ask the event promoter to help you promote. And they sort of, especially if they cancel the show, they kind of owe you something, because they have not kept their promise of the show. So you might be able to get them to help you promote to their audience, especially if it's a trade association that's main sponsor, like we mentioned for the Interfex. The ISPE is a big promoter or a big sponsor, and they may be willing to help, maybe partner with the webinar where you get their audience involved, or maybe be a speaker, or maybe just put notice out to their audience about the webinar. Doesn't hurt to ask. They may not do it, but they may say, okay, we can do that. We can help you promote it. Or maybe they'll charge a little bit. Maybe they'll say, sure, we can promote your webinar. We want you to buy an ad in our weekly e-newsletter. Say, that's okay. That's a good way to get your information out there. And if they'll do it for free, great. If they charge a little bit, that's fine. Pay for it. Okay, those are the 7 steps. And anybody have any questions out there, go ahead and type them in the chat pane or the question pane. We'll give that a few seconds. If you've never done a webinar, it can seem a bit daunting. I've heard companies say, well, we're afraid if we put on a webinar, nobody will come. That's valid. I mean, if you do a webinar and nobody shows up, then something went wrong. But even if you don't get anybody to show up, you can do the webinar anyways. Just do the webinar, record it, and now you've got a great asset to share with your audience on your website or in advertisements or in email newsletters. So you should do it anyways, even if nobody shows up. Other folks say, well, we don't really think we don't want to embarrass ourselves, and we don't really have anybody, and all kinds of excuses I've heard. I say just go ahead and do it. Forge ahead and do it. And if you follow the guidelines and check, we have a checklist too I can offer you. If you go through it logically and you practice and you make sure your message and your topic are honed to your audience, you'll have a good webinar. Guarantee it. Okay, Cassidy, do we have any questions coming in?
Yep, we have a few questions.
Okay.
One of the questions is from Mark, and they're wondering, is there an ideal length of time / best time of day for a webinar?
Yeah, length of time that's a good question. The length of time of a webinar, it really depends on the topic. For example, this one we're doing today we've got it set for 45 minutes, which I think is an ideal time because it gives folks, if it goes the whole 45 minutes, then it gives folks 15 minutes in between maybe their next meeting. So I like 45 minutes. I've seen them as short as 20 minutes. I've seen them as long as an hour and a half. And I wouldn't say go an hour and a half. That's pretty tedious, unless it's really specifically like a training webinar. So I think ideal is 45 minutes. That's my opinion. And best time of day, yeah, there is best practice, and a lot of the webinar providers have done research and studies on that. Best time of day is mid-morning or right after lunch. That's what the data says. Another question, Cass?
Yep, another question from Kimberly. She's wondering about the tools that we use for the webinar, the invites and the tracking of attendees.
We use GoToWebinar for our webinars, and GoToWebinar, it's a good platform because you can do everything right from the platform. Everything meaning the email invitations, uploading a list, email confirmations, reminder emails, and even post-webinar emails. You can do that all right from the platform. It's not the most versatile. It's hard to get like the email invitation and the confirmations and so on exactly how you like them. But it is pretty easy tool to use. If you want more customization, for example, for the registration page or for the emails themselves and the follow-up emails, you need to have a separate platform that's integrated. So we use HubSpot for our landing pages and our emails, and HubSpot integrates with GoToWebinar. So every time somebody signs up with GoToWebinar, it sends the person over to HubSpot, and then HubSpot, we send out follow-up emails. But there's lots of combinations. GoToWebinar, I always use, and I like it. It's reliable. There's WebEx is one that's owned by Oracle. That's a very powerful platform, and it's also expensive. There's tons of them out there. But the key point for the tools is make sure you use a webinar platform. And the reason I say that is because they're designed for one-to-many presentations. If you try to use a meeting platform like GoToMeeting or Skype or something like that, you're going to be disappointed, and it's going to probably cause problems. So purchase a webinar platform. I think GoToWebinar, I think for 500 attendees or more is a couple $100 a month, something like that. So it's not bad. Okay, good questions, folks. Thanks for sending those in. Cassidy, any more questions?
Yeah, we have a question from John, and they're wondering how much does it cost to create and produce a webinar?
Cost of a webinar, it depends on your resources. If you can do the whole thing in-house and you don't count the time of your employees as a cost, and you can do it for next to nothing. You have to pay for the platform, as I just mentioned. But other than that, it doesn't really cost anything. The cost will add up if you hire a company to produce and create the webinar for you. That would be a cost, and that could be anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000. And other costs could be your advertising or promotion costs. Other costs could be if you hire an expert outside your company to present. So really, it can be, I guess the answer is it can be anywhere from $200 for a month for the platform on up to $5,000 to $10,000. So it's a really wide range. Next question.
Yep, Taylor, they're wondering, should I do?
Whoops, I think you broke up there, Cassidy.
Oh, sorry. Should I do a webinar even if my trade show is just postponed?
That's going to be a judgment call on your part. I would say yes, because let's say like the Interfex show, let's say it's postponed from April to July, then July comes around and it's still not ready, then we postpone it to September. That's 6 months from when you anticipated getting those leads and filling that sales pipeline to when the show actually happens. So you've got a 6-month lag there. That can really affect your sales pipeline. So even if it's postponed, I would say consider doing your webinar anyways. And worst case, you do your webinar and it helps get people to the show when it actually happens. So my answer to that would be yes. Next question.
Okay, this question is from Sam, And they're wondering, how do I convert webinar attendees to revenue?
That's the key, isn't it? Converting the webinar attendees or the trade show booth visitors, converting them to actual business. A webinar, you would do it, you're saying it the same way. And so if somebody attends your webinar, then I would expect your sales team to follow up with every person at least that attends, if not every person that registers. Because even if they register and don't show up, they have a reason for registering. They've got some kind of a problem and you've got the solution. So worst case, your salespeople call up everyone who attended and say, hey, Joe, I saw you attended our webinar about CFR 21 CFR Part 11 and was just wondering what you were looking for help with. It's that easy. And then there's this social proof or social reason that they'll have the conversation. It's called reciprocity, because you've shared a gift with them, the gift of knowledge, and they want to reciprocate. Humans, we always want to reciprocate, even if it's please and thank you. We want to reciprocate. So they'll have the conversation with you because they appreciate the gift that you gave them. So it's a perfect list to have the conversation. And then after that, you just go through your regular sales process, whatever that is. You connect with someone, you ask them what they need help with, and they say, boy, I really need a good system to monitor the relative humidity and temperature in our drug storage room that complies with the FDA. It's like, oh, well, we happen to have something like that. You might not say that, but you would then go through the sales process. So really it's the same as your trade show booth leads. Any other questions coming in, Cassidy? Is that it?
We have one more.
Okay.
One more from Peter, and he's wondering, what do I do if I don't have a willing subject matter expert?
Yeah, you got to have an expert. That's true. And if you can't find somebody who's willing and able in your company, consider hiring somebody outside. For example, for the Intervex show, for the expert to talk about 21 CFR Part 11, then there's expert consultants out there who I'm sure you could probably pay, maybe you start paying them a couple of $1,000s for the process or whatever they charge. Even if they charge $10,000, it's probably worth it, especially if they have a following. So if you don't have somebody to be a subject matter expert, then, and you can't hire somebody, you might, if you can't get an expert, then maybe you don't do the webinar, frankly, because you got to have somebody who gets you that credibility and gets you that that top of mind awareness. So that's an important consideration. All right, folks, I don't see any other questions coming in. Last chance for questions, and then got one last slide. So I've got a webinar resource package. If you're thinking about giving this a try, then this package is pretty good. It's a 128-day checklist. I think there's 65 steps on it. You've got an 8-step guide, and then there's the sweet spot topic template that we showed earlier. And then there's a day of event checklist. And if you want that package, I can send it to you as a nice clean zip file. Just type in the chat pane right now if you want it. There's no charge for it. Just say, send me the package in the chat pane and I'll send it out to you. Then there's our webinar services. And Cassidy, would you put the chat in the chat pane, a link to our webinar services? If you need some help with that, we're happy to help. If you want to just have a call, a free phone call and talk about it, I'm happy to do that. So use us as a resource. Maybe we can make your lives a little easier. And that's what we're here for. And then for Manufacturing Marketing Group, we're a HubSpot partner. We help with marketing tactics and strategy. We help with sales process and CRM for geared to industrial companies. Okay, yeah, I see a few folks have asked package, and I will email those out to you. And thanks very much, everyone, for attending today.